Hello everyone, it's Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Now, it is no secret that back during World War II, the Germans did a lot. Like, a lot. It's probably a bit of an understatement for me to say that they did a lot, because, well, if we have any understanding of history, we kind of saw what happened over the course of those few years. But one of the things that we are also distinctly aware of is that it wasn't just conventional weapons, the gun, the artillery piece, the human man that the Germans were trying to use back during this time. Nope, the Germans at this time spent a lot of resources, as in a lot of resources that probably could have gone elsewhere, in the purpose of trying to develop wonder weapons. AKA any kind of weapon that was going to be vastly superior to anything that their opponents had, something that would be able to turn the tides of war and single-handedly win things for them. This could come in a variety of different forms. You had German wonder weapons that would range from guided missiles to fighter jets, and while there were many countless weapons that were created, the majority of them were simply not very good. Like at all. And of the ones that even were good, not necessarily many of those even made it to combat in the first place. Hell, an even larger amount of those never even made it into production in the first place. Like, there was absolutely no hope of them seeing combat, they were just merely an idea. And by the time a number of them were actually put into place to actually be used in combat, well, by then it was pretty much too late for the German war machine to actually turn the tides of the war. So my friends, in today's video, we're going to be going over 3 German wonder weapons. Their little history, their story, what made them possible, or impossible, to say the least. So buckle up and let's have some fun. The first weapon on this list that we're going to be talking about is the Landcruiser P-1000 Ratte. Yeah, this weapon, from what you can see here, is a massive, massive tank, and I don't think words can really describe exactly how stupidly big this thing is. It is the biggest, heaviest tank that has ever been designed. Designed, not created. That's a very important thing to mention here. Per its inception, the Ratte would have weighed 1,000 tons, or to put it into other perspective, 1 million kilograms, which is a lot. This thing was designed to be 115 feet long, 36 feet tall, and 46 feet wide. For those of you who are not utilizing freedom units, that would be around 35 meters in length, 11 meters tall, and 14 meters wide. Which is a lot, as you can imagine. This thing was essentially a massive battleship on land. I'm not going to say on wheels, because there's no way in hell that any kind of wheels could ever function with something of this size, because they would just either immediately break or they would dig into the ground with no hope of actually moving. Not that this tank, by its design, was actually going to be capable of moving anyway. Which is odd to say, because the desired speed for this tank was that it was supposed to be able to reach speeds of 24 miles per hour, which I will just say right now was more than likely going to be some very, very severe wishful thinking. Like, it just wasn't going to happen, Chief. The tank itself was designed by a man by the name of Albert Speer, who, funnily enough, was not exactly someone who was more famous as a weapons designer or creator. No, he was an architect, which just makes way too much sense when you're taking a skyscraper and saying, hey, let's just lay it flat, add wheels to it, and slap guns on it. Because honestly, that seems to be what this thing was in the first place. And as you can probably guess, because of everything that I've told you so far, this tank was never actually built because of the Maus program, which was another German super heavy tank. And the Maus program, well, this involved a tank that was only 175 tons, yet despite the fact that it was significantly lighter than the Landcruiser, it performed terribly, like absolutely terribly. I think something along the lines of only 2 chassis of it was ever actually built. The problem was, when you seem to go too big when it comes to a vehicle that is on land, it just can't seem to support its own weight. One of the key problems that it has is that the Maus was simply too big to cross any kinds of bridges. If it went across it, the bridge was going to collapse, which meant that the only way that it had to be able to cross any kind of river system was to go through it, like underwater. And as you can imagine, from such a heavy tank, this is not something that was ever going to be easy. But either way, on paper, when it comes to the weapons that it would have, the armaments for the tank were truly insane, like naval gun level insane. The Ratte was supposed to have 2 280mm guns that were mounted in a turret for literal warships. It simultaneously would have been equipped with an 18mm gun, 8 20mm flat guns in order to fight off enemy aircraft, because this is a tank that was naturally going to be a massive target for any kind of opposing aircraft that would be able to see it, which at this point I would think is going to be very hard to actually miss. Ah, yes, and two 15mm Mauser machine guns. Yes, of course, can't forget about those. Simultaneously, the tank would have had 6 1.2-meter tracks, but the weight of the tank was so incredibly big that with these tracks, that would have meant that any road that it tried to drive on, it would completely obliterate. Or hell, it doesn't even need to be a paved road. You go onto the dirt road and you might as well be using an excavator to actually move the damn thing. Realistically speaking, this thing has absolutely no right to exist, and there's a very good reason that it never made it off paper in the first place. It was simply way too big. And speaking of stupidly large things that honestly have no right existing, did you know that back during World War II, the Nazis had a plan to create a ship that was going to be literally twice the size of the Japanese Imperial Yamato? Yeah, you heard me right. We're talking about the Imperial Yamato that was the largest battleship ever created on Earth, and we are talking about something that is going to be twice that size. This is a super battleship that would have dwarfed the Tirpitz and the Bismarck, the battleships that were the pride of the German Navy. So what happens with them? A core aspect of Adolf Hitler's Plan Z, designs for these ships began in 1937, with the planned completion date for all of them being 1944. Once they were laid down, it was estimated that each one would take approximately 50 months in order to actually complete, and that was as they were conceived in 1937. Two of the warships actually began construction, with the Schlachtschiff H being laid down by Blom and Voss in Hamburg on June 15, 1939, while the Schlachtschiff J was actually laid down by A.G. Wesser in Bremen in August 15th of 1939. This being just 2 weeks before Germany would go and invade Poland. However, unfortunately for them, what happened is that construction ended up being halted in October, as the war effort primarily then had to focus on construction of U-boats rather than battleships. By 1940, the material that was going to be used in the construction of the two super battleships ended up being scrapped and had to be directed to other uses, because, again, they needed the material for more immediate needs. Now, you would think that this should have been the end of the H-class, but no, we're talking about Germany in World War II, and the idea of letting go a super weapon, no matter how ridiculous that was not something that suited them whatsoever. So instead of completely shelving the ideas, instead they decided to turn around and improve upon them. And by improve upon them, I mean make them even bigger, because again, this is Germany in World War II. What else would they do? Mind you, this is after the sinking of the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst, which should have been the signal that the idea of super battleships was just not something that was going to be practical and actually work. But no, German designers wanted bigger and better. If the Japanese Imperial Yamato was supposed to be 70,000 tons, then the German H-41 that they were designing was going to be 76,000 tons. The H-42 that came after that was going to be a massive 98,000 tons, and then the H-43 and H-44 respectively finally reached a grand total of 141,000 tons. Mind you, that was larger in tonnage and longer than a US Navy Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. Unlike these later American carriers, the German battleships that were being designed were not going to use nuclear energy. No, instead, they were going to use 12 diesel-powered engines. Whether or not these things would have been possible to get the 30 knots speed that they wanted, well, I would just going to say here from the very beginning that is probably unlikely considering other German plans at the time, and how those turned out. It's probably not going to happen. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that the Germans were focusing on size, the H-classes actually planned on having for weapons 8 40.6 centimeter guns, which would have been smaller than Yamato's 9 46 centimeter guns, meaning that these things would have technically had less range despite being on a ship that was double the size, and technically by that logic could have been equipped with bigger guns. It's a little bit odd to think about there. But along with the Japanese A-150 and the American Montana class, the whole thing with the H-class for the German Navy was probably something that was significantly better on paper than in anything else. It really was not something that was going to work out for them. Just no, absolutely not. Hell, by the end, this seemed to be something more that was a giant delusion dreamed up by a madman more than anything else. It's just insane. The H-class just truly was not grounded in reality. So if you couldn't have something that was grounded in reality, what about the sky? Could it fly? Yeah, okay, I know that was a bad pun, just deal with it. Okay, I understand. Next up, we are going to be talking about the Messerschmitt Me-262A1A, aka the Schwalbe. Schwab. God damn it. Basically, it was something that its nickname meant the Swallow. And no, commenters, don't look at me like that. Don't say it. I know. Okay, me saying that, I understand. The Me-262 was the world's first turbojet aircraft. Now, I say that because unlike the other inventions on this list, this is actually something that ended up being created and utilized in battle. At least it was used to a degree. There was a whole bunch of other issues that ended up happening with it. Conceived back in the year 1938, the Me-262 was going to go through a very long gestation period. Like, it took a long time for this thing to actually get out into the scene. In fact, it did not even make its first flight until April 18th, 1941, but even then, that was going to be leagues ahead of what the Allies were doing in terms of aircraft and fighters. Though at the time, this wasn't going to be done under the power of a jet engine, but rather under the power of a Junkers Jumo 210G piston engine of around 700 horsepower. Jet engine development, although it was significantly more advanced in Germany, was not exactly something that was the most stable at this time. It was still a little bit finicky. These engines were in a primitive state, and as a result, they simply weren't really ready for the battlefield yet. But so it was that on July 19th, 1942, the first takeoff under jet power ended up being made, and from that point on, the Me-262 was a kind of ray of hope for the Germans, something that they hoped that could be utilized as a weapon in order to, well, at this point, not necessarily turn the tides of the war, but essentially secure their victory, though things were definitely, at this point, beginning to look like they were starting to turn against them. The plane was an absolute beast of a weapon, something that was equipped with an armament of 4 30mm Mk-108 cannons and around 1,000 pounds of bombs. It was powered by 2 Junkers Jumo 004s of 1,980 pounds of thrust each, and this was something that was then capable of reaching speeds up to 540 miles per hour, or for again, those of you who are not using Freedom units, around 870 kilometers per hour. Mind you, this is something that far outclasses the Allies at this point. They do not have anything that is capable of reaching these kinds of speeds equipped this heavily. Hell, for that matter, not even something that was capable of reaching that speeds even if it was not equipped with anything. The unfortunate thing for this plane was that it was always going to have issues with quantity. Simply, not enough of them could be produced. Erhard Milch, who was then the Air Inspector General, had agreed to put this aircraft into large-scale production as a fighter plane, and this would require additional materials and manpower. But the problem was that neither the materials or the manpower were ever really available by the point in the war that this thing wanted to be introduced. Really, past the year 1943, the Nazis were going to be on their back foot, and there wasn't really much that they could do about the situation. As a result, the Me-262 wasn't actually able to be mass-produced until going well into 1944. And hell, as I said earlier, by this point in the war, the Nazis were running out of resources, both in terms of men, material, and everything else you could possibly imagine. With the beginning of rather intense Allied bombing campaigns going into late 1943 and early 1944, the necessity of developing a very fast fighter plane that was going to be able to counter them was something that became ever more urgent. And by April of 1944, the Americans had effectively secured air superiority and were using this opportunity in order to bomb the hell out of the Germans. Even despite this, during this time, Adolf Hitler was still trying to prioritize the 262, not as a fighter, but rather as a bomber. That is what he firmly believed was going to be able to change Nazi positions. When if they had instead just focused on it being a fighter from the very beginning, it would have been significantly more useful. Lack of material, lack of trained pilots, as I said, lack of airfields, lack of facilities to make or repair said planes in the first place, or even the parts that they would need in order to repair them or make them in the first place as well. All of these problems were things that were going to plague the Nazis going into 1943 and would only get worse as time went on. By March of 1945, fighter missions would concentrate on Allied bombers in an effort to knock them out, and on March 18th, 1945, Me-262s would tear into US bomber formations, downing 12 bombers while only losing 3 jets, which, mind you, is a pretty good trade-off in terms of numbers. Despite its short time that it was actually operational, the Me-262 would prove to be superior to pretty much all Allied aircraft at all, accounting for approximately 542 downs for the Allies to only 100 for the Germans. The crazy part about all this is that in the end, although 1,400 something Me-262s were actually made, really only 300 of those ever saw any kind of combat whatsoever. It is actually the only wonder weapon on here that was ever actually used as a weapon. It's kind of crazy to think about how things would have actually turned out if this weapon was something that was properly utilized and managed versus what happened in reality. But hey everyone, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should cover next. I love making little lists of different things in order to introduce you guys to interesting topics, and please let me know what it is that we should cover. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Do anything you can to help this video in the algorithm, and I will see you all here next time. Thank you very much for watching, my guys, and goodbye.